Hi, and welcome to a Voices of Esalen extended edition. I'm Sam Stern. Today, I'm pleased to present another installment of our Psychedelic Integration series, drawn from the 2019 conference of the same name at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. Our topic today is cannabis, considered a psychedelic by some, merely a close relative by others. Regardless of perspective, however, there was surely an inordinate amount of insight and knowledge concerning cannabis at this conference. This episode is comprised of two elements. First, a panel on cannabis, which included Martin Lee, Rick Doblin, Ben Sessa, Julie Holland, Marsha Rosenbaum, and Allan Badiner, and then a speech on CBD and the endo-cannabinoid system itself, presented by Martin Lee. If you're seeking to more completely understand the adaptive capacities of marijuana from a therapeutic or medicinal perspective, I think you'll really enjoy listening to these experts. And so you'll know a bit about them, I've included Allan Badiner's introductory remarks as a preface for each speaker. So with no further ado, let's talk about cannabis.
As a columnist in the 80s at the LA Weekly, I was writing about mind and spirit movements, everything from psychoneuroimmunology to Tony Robbins to Thich Nhat Hanh. I was planning to check out a psychedelic conference down the road, but I was busy building a house nearby and having issues with the contractor. So a friend of mine said, look, I know a college student who had some experience building houses. I could send him over and you could consult with him about your problems with your contractor. So he did indeed. His name was Rick Doblin. And I told Rick what my issues were, and he said, but Allan, have you thought about it from the contractor's point of view? I wanted to throw him off the property, but I held myself and I said, what is your career ambitions? I'm just curious. And he straight up said, I learned at Esalen I'm going to be a psychedelic therapist. And I looked at him like, is there such a thing? And then he said, and then I'm going to go to JFK, I'm going to go to Kennedy School of Government, and I need to then meet the players, and I need to change all the laws. I said, oh my God. I actually believed that he would do all the things he said, but I thought it would take a few more lifetimes. I wonder, Rick, if it's surprising to you that your life and the culture at large has evolved exactly as you planned. I thought so. Wow. What a great example of the persistent power of good intention. Thank you for being here, Rick.
The long-term goal for MAPS is to, as a nonprofit, is to think about what's the least expensive form that cannabis can become a medicine, and how does that act as, in some ways, a check on the for-profit pharmaceutical companies that are going to try to make various extracts that they can put into delivery systems that are non-smoking that they can then patent and then charge a lot of money. So the example of Epidiolex, the CBD drug that's from GW Pharmaceuticals for childhood epilepsy, it's very expensive, and it could be in the neighborhood of $30,000, $40,000 a year for CBD. It's in a spray, so it's a little bit easier for kids, but it's still very, very expensive. So the least expensive form is in the flowers that are just cut and presented as flowers, and then people can use them either smoking or vaporizing, or they can make them into oils or whatever they want to do. So what we've been trying since, I'll go back a little bit, since in 1992, we started working with a marijuana study for AIDS wasting. We got FDA approval, IRB approvals, but the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has a monopoly on the supply of federally legal marijuana, wouldn't sell us any of the marijuana until we looked at the risks and gave up looking at the benefits. Then we worked with Ethan Russo. That was with Donald Abrams. Then we worked with Ethan Russo and did a project with marijuana for migraines. And the same old story, that we got FDA approval, IRB approval, and NIDA refused to sell us the marijuana. So then I realized the problem was the monopoly, and we would stop dealing with trying to do more studies and try to end the monopoly. So I spent a year trying to find the Rosa Parks of medical marijuana production. And we finally found this guy, Lau Craker, who was someone who had an expertise in plant medicines. He didn't smoke marijuana. He'd worked on military but sort of secure projects trying to look at herbicides for coca plants. So he had all the security clearances that were necessary, and he really cared about research more than anything else. And so we started in 2000 to try to break this monopoly. In 2005, we had a lawsuit against the DEA. We won the lawsuit, but yet again, as in MDMA, the DEA rejected the recommendation of the judge. And then we lost in the appeals court. And so we kept whittling away at it. And then what happened was that finally, in August of 2016, shortly before Obama's term ended, shortly before the November election that brought us Trump, the DEA said that they would end the monopoly. They put a notice in the Federal Register and said that it was time for the monopoly to end, and that their argument, what I really liked about it, is that for decades and decades, this monopoly has been in existence since 1968. And the DEA has always claimed that there's international treaty obligations that block them from giving more than one license. It was never true. It was always just a ruse. But they would go on and on and on about that. And so in this notice in the Federal Register, what happened was they said, oh, yeah, of course we can do this within the international treaty obligations. And they had 2 paragraphs that would explain how they would do it. Super simple. And then since that point, people started applying for licenses. But then Trump got elected and then put in Attorney General Sessions. And so there's been roughly 26 applicants for setting up federally legal marijuana that can either go through the FDA, or you could make it into federally legal medicinal products or herb foods, whatever, but all federally legal. And so finally, once Trump got rid of Sessions, now it looks like Attorney General Barr is open to it. So we've had a lot of senators that have been working with us, particularly Republican senators, Orrin Hatch, Grassley, Cory Gardner from Colorado. And so what happened several days ago was that a group of senators wrote another letter to Barr and said that it's time for you to license more companies, and you've said that you would do that in your confirmation hearings. And so we'll wait and see about a month or two. We've already written up another lawsuit against the DEA and the Attorney General for what would be called unreasonable delay if they wait too long. So hopefully we won't have to file that lawsuit, but maybe we'll see. So I think that's the key step. The next step would be to have domestic production that we can make into a medicine, because the National Institute on Drug Abuse marijuana, which is of poor quality, but it's only for academic research. It cannot be made into a commercial sales. So that's how they blocked marijuana from becoming a medicine. And that's why we have all these state medical marijuana laws, but nothing federally, because this marijuana cannot be used in phase 3 studies. So phase 3 studies, you have to use the exact same drug you want to market. So hopefully that'll end in a couple months, and if not, we'll sue them. But I do think that there's more and more support for that, for it ending.
Ben Sessa is in the house. Ben has a successful practice as a psychedelic psychiatrist in London and curates my favorite conference every year at the Old Naval Academy in Greenwich, just outside of London. Breaking Convention. What a great name for it, too. Scientists, writers, and researchers give presentations and present papers, as well as poets and artists share their work. Breaking Convention is itself a cultural change agent, as well as Ben and his awesome sense of humor. I'm delighted that he made the long trip over here to teach. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much we in the UK can teach you lot about cannabis. We, very sadly, are still languishing in the Middle Ages in terms of our drug laws in the UK. Cannabis is a Schedule 1 Class B substance. Schedule 1 meaning it has no medical value, it is dangerous and addictive. So the law says. Class B meaning you could be spending 6 years in prison for possession of any amount at all, from the tiniest crumb to a big old wodge of it. So very restrictive laws, and we've been lobbying the government for a long time, myself and my colleague David Nutt, on this issue, putting piles and piles of data on the desks of successive governments for years and getting nowhere. Until last year, a couple of high-profile pediatric epilepsy cases hit the front page of the newspaper, and suddenly overnight the Conservative government starts to look a bit more favourably at medicinal cannabis in the UK. Now, this is obviously a great thing, but very frustrating for us, as we've been piling them with data for a very long time, and all it takes is a couple of heart-rendering front-page tabloid paper reports, and then suddenly the government says... So what they're saying at the moment is the Conservative government said they are prepared to look on a case-by-case basis at the possibility of medical marijuana through a specialist committee, the ACMD, which is a government-approved drugs committee. Now, in reality, not a single person has actually been treated with medical cannabis in the UK, because although they've said they would do this, when it comes down to it, they're not approving anything. And one of the problems is the cost. A similar sort of problem to Rick's describing. There may be the will there may be the evidence, there may be the medical evidence to support it, but where do you actually get the product? Because actually getting government-approved cannabis is very difficult. The last I heard last week was a course of government-approved UK cannabis, were it to be approved for a single case, would be about £700 a month for the equivalent amount of cannabis of about £40 a month. So there's nobody in their right mind who would sign up to that. So what we're trying to do, and I've got a meeting just when I get back, actually, we're going to start just trying to set up a lobby group of just getting consultant psychiatrists around the UK to just start making recommendations endlessly to this ACMD committee. So they're going to get hundreds and hundreds of requests every week of this patient deserves cannabis and here's the evidence to demonstrate why. And the evidence is strong. And, I hear on a daily basis in my addictions clinic, if I smoke some cannabis, I don't have as much heroin. I don't use as much in the way of benzodiazepines. I don't use as much alcohol. And what I've been trying to say to my employer is, what doctor in their right mind would say, don't do that? You tell me if you use cannabis, you don't need to do this. What am I supposed to say? No, don't do that. Here, take quetiapine instead. You would be a lousy doctor to do that. So I'm trying to really push this, that we've got to follow what our patients are asking for. Cannabis is primarily a benign compound. There are harms, there are risks, there are addiction issues as well. We know that, and we're seeing more in the way of cannabis addiction with the higher THC strains. It absolutely exists, cannabis addiction. It's very rare, don't see much of it, but if you smoke enough of it regularly all day long, you will develop a dependency syndrome with physical symptoms, and we see that. But that's a very rare thing. The other thing that's even rarer, although this makes the front page, is the psychotogenic risk of cannabis, and we've touched on this over the last few days. Certain number of people who will smoke cannabis and have a psychosis, but it's interestingly the same percentage of people for whom they have schizophrenia in the community anyway. So it's a psychosis spectrum, and certainly for people on that spectrum at the high risk end, personal family history of schizophrenia or bipolar 1, generally I would say avoid cannabis. There's other drugs that are not so likely to trigger psychosis. But again, that is rare. So the message I give to my patients, and indeed my own children, I would say the riskiest thing about cannabis is it works. It does what it says on the tin. It's a cognitive impairer in general, and certainly if you're a young person, if you're a child and you're 14 years old and you're smoking loads of weed all day long, it's way more interesting than your history essay you've got to write. So I think the biggest risk for young people in cannabis is just that unless you're a very mature child, it's difficult to separate work from leisure and to prioritize taking your exams. So I generally tend to tell the children and young people I work with to just lay off it until you're kind of 18, and then you'll probably be okay. And for most adults using cannabis, it's benign and not problematic at all the whole of their lives. But there are certainly some risks. But final thing, just about the legal aspect, and I just wanted to say this because I get so irritated by this. My friends here in California who you're all complaining about the monopolization and the corporatization of cannabis industry, and fair play because you've seen it change. there's me in the UK. I could go to prison for 6 years for that 2 grams of vegetable matter in my pocket. And you're moaning about whose name it is above the dispensary door? You are so lucky that you can walk into a shop legally, speak to someone, see a whole range of cannabis products and walk out with it in your hand. I could go to prison for 6 years for the tiniest crumb. So I appreciate your complaints about the monopolization and corporatization, but shut up.
Martin Lee, author of Acid Dreams, very interesting book. And more recently, Smoke Signals, an important book on the history of cannabis. We met on the book circuit. I love his new book, Smoke Signals. He told me all about his interest in cannabinoids and CBD. It turns out that the cannabinoid system of the body is the new, exciting focus of medicine. He invited me to attend an ICRS meeting, International Cannabinoid Research Society. I loved it. It was fascinating. I only understood about 10% of it, but Martin Lee speaks science, so he was able to write it up and publish it on projectcbd.org. That is a fantastic site. If you're looking for scientifically correct information and the latest research about CBD, which is on fire right now, that's the place to look, projectcbd.org. Martin, it's great to have you here. Thank you.
I don't know anybody who's waiting for cannabis to be declared a medicine in California. It was declared that in 1996. We seem to be moving that way on a federal level. I don't know. That could happen very quickly. It could stretch out for how many more years, this ridiculous prohibition. But, from my perspective, the challenge isn't to get the federal government to say what we knew 5,000 years ago in ancient China, that cannabis is a medicine, but to figure out how do we use it. Because we've been cut off from this because of the illegality and the distortion therein. And that can be a little bit challenging and tricky. And I was struck after the talk I gave, I guess it was yesterday, when I was talking about folks who don't jive well with the plant, that they feel that the plant doesn't like them, they don't have a pleasant experience, and they don't go there, particularly with the THC-rich plants. That's really what I'm talking about. And many people came up to me, and subsequent to that, saying, I'm one of those people. It was like, and for those who weren't there, I was pointing out that there are, you might say, genetic variants that affect how people metabolize THC. And some people don't readily metabolize it so easily. It stays in their system, very sensitive to it, and they just don't like cannabis. And that actually there are a racial breakdown of that. About 20-25% of Caucasians have that situation. Anyway, but it underscores how it's, for those people, there are options. There are CBD-rich options that they can get medical benefits from cannabis and still feel okay about it. But cannabis is a very tricky plant, and I call it a trickster plant. And a lot of things are counterintuitive about it, particularly about how to relate to it. And is that there's a kind of a meme. I'm in a relationship with the plant, that people say in the cannabis. And there's actually something to that. Your relationship does evolve with it. It doesn't stay static. Sometimes you got to take a break, and then you go back to it, refresh, whatever. But one thing that's quite striking, and it resonates with something that Paul was saying yesterday, very small doses of cannabis seem to have very powerful effects. In fact, some of the animal studies, I know we don't like these things, but what it's showing, some of this work out of Israel, the preclinical research, almost tiny, minuscule doses of THC or CBD provoke long-lasting neuroprotective effects or cardioprotective effects or liver protective effects. And some of the clinical research shows in terms of cannabis as a painkiller. They've dialed it in. They know how much CBD and THC on average works optimally for a person, because GW Pharmaceuticals has done this research for Sativex, which is approved in several countries. About 20 milligrams of Sativex, optimal for pain control. If you double that, it gets less effective. If you triple it, it's not even working at all as a painkiller. So that's counterintuitive, and yet we don't know that because we've lost this connection with the plant. And now I think that the challenge at hand really is how to remake that connection and share the knowledge around it. That's what we're doing at Project CBD. But I think I'm not scared of the pharmaceuticalization of cannabis. You know, it's happening. I'm the least fan of big pharma, but it's just we don't have any control over what they're going to do with this GW Pharmaceuticals or any dozen startups that are trying to focus on single molecules and claim they're good for a particular condition and go through the whatever they have to, all the hoops, which is formidable. But that's going to happen. It's fine with me, but these single molecules, they're just one little part of the tool chest, and it's a much more interesting tool chest there when you look at combinations and whole plant spectrums, and then you can factor in terpenes and flavonoids and these other factors in the plant. It really is a treasure chest, as Ralph M. Schulam described cannabis. But when we compare the efficacy of the single molecules to the whole plant's always better. It turns out you need much less of CBD if it's in a whole plant configuration as compared to a single molecule thing. But again, it's very ironic and tricksterish here. I'll just close with one point. It mentions Epidiolex. It's a pharmaceutical CBD that's legal in this country for certain conditions of childhood epilepsy, these catastrophic seizure disorders. But I know doctors in California who are working with these little children who have these terrible seizure disorders, and the parents are spending money through the internet buying these oils. And they're spending a lot of money, and they can't afford to do that. But if they have health insurance, what one particular physician is doing is prescribing Epidiolex, meaning single molecule CBD. They can get it for free because the health insurance covers it. And then they take this stuff and add it to the stuff they're buying from the internet, these sometimes more effective oils to bring down the monthly cost. So you think, oh, wow, $38,000 a year for Epidiolex. Who can afford that? Well, in a funny way, it's actually helping the very people who couldn't afford it. We have all these tools, and I think bring them on. Let's have a lot more. But just remember that, unfortunately, the political realities are that the pharmaceuticalized versions are the ones that privilege in terms of legality and in terms of what gets sanctioned by the culture. And this is still underground or semi-underground when you're dealing with the whole plan. And this whole situation can change dramatically, if when it becomes legal on a federal level, as the momentum seems to be going there, and it could happen sooner than we think, or it can drag on a lot longer. But this just changes the whole game here, because that's not what the FDA is generally in the business of doing, approving plants as medicines. But now they really are stuck in between a rock and a hard place at the FDA, because they have to deal with CBD, and it's like it's completely disordered their cosmos. The usual way they do it, they go to bat for the pharmaceutical and they suppress the herbs. They can't do that now because there's this huge demand for CBD.
Marsha Rosenbaum is Director Emerita at Drug Policy Alliance, a longtime activist and writer, and who specializes in drug policy for young people, about young people. She has written a book called Safety First, a reality-based approach to teens and drugs. There are copies on that table, and she's brought them as gifts for you. If you know people who have kids and teens, that's an important book for them. She's also co-wrote with Jerome Beck a book called Pursuit of Ecstasy, the MDMA Experience. Marsha and I served together on a psychedelic funding circle for Threshold Foundation. It's so much fun to have you here. Thank you for being here.
So I'm going to interject some information and thoughts about policy and what makes it possible, really, for us to have these discussions and deal with these dilemmas and these conflicts. I just want to share with you a remark that a sociologist named Lynn Zimmer made to me right around 1990. We were commiserating about the drug war, which was in really full swing at that time. People were getting arrested. People were going to prison for a long time. That got us mass incarceration, on and on. And she says, well, she says, the most popular drug, the largest, I don't know what you would call it, is marijuana. If you take marijuana out of the mix, since most people use it, then you basically take the guts out of the drug war. Okay, so listen to that. And of course, I'm in California. We are in California here. And California is the largest state. And so in 1996, the Drug Policy Alliance got behind and put the money together for Prop 215. Prop 215, medical marijuana. And that was the beginning. We knew that with medical marijuana, ultimately we would get to full legalization, which we did 20 years later in 1996. A lot of work, policy work, went into both of those laws. I want to add to what Ben said. Not only is full recreational, that you walk into a store, and believe me, there's a nice store on Lombard Street. I love it. You go shopping and go to Walgreens, and I go to the market, and I go by the pot store. It's great. But what it is more important than that, because, we really could get it from all the way from Prop 215. All you needed was a card. But what's more important is the expungements of people's prior records, that thousands and thousands of people are having their criminal records cleared. And that's the most important thing, on top of far, far, far fewer arrests and all of that. But what happened with this industry is that it has grown and grown and grown. A lot of people are making a lot of money with this industry. One kind of sad thing is that many of them, if not most now, have forgotten how they got there. It's like the cannabis legalization fell from the trees, and they're making a ton of money.
Yeah, so just a few fun factoids, and I defer to Martin Lee when it comes to the history of cannabis in every respect. So you flag me if I'm off base, Marty. We've had medical cannabis in India for 5,000 years, and it's still that way. It's still available. The government makes sure that those who feel they need it can get it. And it also has an extensive spiritual history in India. There is one sect of Hinduism that uses it as a sacrament, and it grows behind every single temple in India. The back behind the temple, there is cannabis cultivation, and the sadhus and the holy men who have devoted their life to spirituality can come and get the resin off the plants with their hands and scoop it into a chillum and smoke it. And that has a long history. That's just interesting. Also, they took it seriously as a medicine. There's a history, particularly in Bengal, where there's a whole pharmacopoeia related to how to use cannabis medically. And I think a lot of that had been translated when England took control of India. And they found it fascinating, and that spread throughout the English-speaking world. And then we started, I don't know if there was a direct link or if it was a coincidence, but suddenly we were starting to see doctors suggest it to their patients, and major drug companies, every single one of them, Eli Lilly, all of the big drug companies had cannabis products. This is now in the 20s, or actually earlier, even the early 1900s. They had cannabis, sativa, available in every drugstore in America for over 25 years. So this is what the federal government and John Anslinger in particular set out to crush. And at that point, the AMA had brought 4 lawsuits against the government for criminalization of cannabis. Because their clients, the doctors, really wanted that to be an option that they could use. So just thought that would be interesting to add. Julie Holland is a highly respected psychedelic psychiatrist and author of the Pot Book, Ecstasy, The Complete Guide, and others. I think we met at Breaking Convention, but when she was the moderator for Alex Gray and I at a book event at the Rubin Museum, it was clear that she was amazing. She was up to date on the scientific medicine research. She was experienced where it matters most in therapy with people who are in pain. And we're going to hear more about her new thinking. It's called Oneness, a Unified Theory of Connection. Thank you so much for being here, Julie.
One of the things that cannabis does is it helps you forget things. And it can help you forget what you were saying, which is a disruption in working memory. And one of the connections between cannabis and schizophrenia, and I'm not saying that it causes it, but I'm saying if you look at schizophrenia and if you look at somebody when they're really high on cannabis, they have disruptions in working memory. Both of these groups will forget what they were saying. But we need to forget. You can't keep all the data that's going in you every day. And one of the reasons that we sleep and that we dream is that the brain is figuring out what to keep and what to get rid of. And the endo-cannabinoid system helps us forget. And one of the reasons why cannabis helps with PTSD is that there are fewer nightmares and there's fewer rememberings of the trauma. There's fewer intrusions into memory of flashbacks because you're helping to forget. The joke I made on Monday morning about it's like childbirth. You forget the pain. You do forget the pain. It's very hard to remember it. It's the endocannabinoid system sort of wiping it clean, and you're not going to remember it.
My work really is with Project CBD, and that's a nonprofit that focuses on cannabis science and therapeutics and somewhat political economy. You can't really avoid that. And it's an educational platform, projectcbd.org. We have a brisk web traffic these days, about 500,000 visitors a month. What is it that we do? We translate science into English, science into Spanish now as well. We're looking to translate into other languages if we have the resources. So if anybody wants to adopt the language for projectcbd.org, you can see me after the class. But Project CBD isn't just an educational platform, it's also an activist group. And we were responsible for introducing CBD into the medical marijuana milieu in California back in 2009, 2010. At that time, very few people really knew about CBD. CBD is cannabidiol. It's a non-intoxicating component of the cannabis plant. It has a lot of very intriguing therapeutic attributes. And the idea at the time was, as a small group of journalists, we were aware of what scientists were reporting on about CBD based on their experiments with mice. But scientists were talking to each other, and what they were saying really was jaw-dropping as a journalist covering these conferences. And then when we were party to the rediscovery of some of the plants in Northern California that we called CBD-rich, it really raised a whole host of possibilities. The medical marijuana experience initially was very much a THC-oriented experience, THC, the high causer. CBD, if I would characterize it these days, it would be sort of colossal big dollars. It's exploded. It's become such a huge phenomenon. But in those days, very few people within the medical marijuana world that we were interacting, including doctors that knew about CBD. This was a new thing. And we felt that if the impact on people, if they took CBD or CBD-rich cannabis, if it was anything like the scientists were reporting about what it did to the mice, that this was going to be huge in terms of therapeutic possibilities. So we were involved actually in actively introducing CBD, seeding the landscape, but it wasn't seeds we were sharing, it was clones. We were giving away hundreds of clones of the CBD-rich plants to get it going, because as a journalist, unless people were taking this stuff, there's nothing to write about, really. So we needed the story to unfold. But we also had another agenda at that time. And we felt that because CBD is non-intoxicating, that it had the potential to liberate cannabis from the drug abuse paradigm. Because in 2009, 2010, it wasn't a cakewalk in California. Obama was president, but he was not exactly a profile of courage when it came to cannabis at that time. It was a very uneven situation. There was a lot of pressure on. And we thought that CBD might sort of be the key to ending cannabis prohibition. Things were sort of moving in that direction, but we thought CBD could really be a catalyst, and that was always sort of the hidden agenda for what we were doing. And I think it might be a case of careful what you wish for in terms of what's transpired, because the whole thing has exploded now. And CBD is everywhere. You can get CBD in gas stations anywhere in the country practically. And that's not what exactly we anticipated. It's sort of a mixed bag. But I think I think it was Jim Fadiman, he mentioned that CBD is now going to be in CVS stores and Walgreens. So the whole thing is way out there. I mean, Coca-Cola is talking about including CBD in their products. And I don't know whether to take a victory lap or to cry when I hear this, frankly. Because, the phrase, things go better with Coke, CBD does not go better with Coke. I can assure you about that. But this is all happening. It's way beyond our control. It's very exciting. But part of this, there's some misconceptions that are being promoted as part of this explosion of the business interest driving it, talking about like $22 billion industry, just CBD alone in a few years. It's crazy. I don't know if these numbers are accurate, but it underscores the excitement around this. But there's some basic misconceptions that are accompanying this explosion of interest in CBD, and it's driven in large part by the CBD industry itself. And the basic misconception really is that CBD is non-psychoactive. That is not correct. CBD is a profound mood changer. It's not an intoxicating agent, but it can, it can really lift one's depression. It is probably unparalleled as a pharmaceutical in terms of as an anxiolytic, as an anti-anxiety agent. So it has tremendous influence on one's psyche. So you can't say it's non-psychoactive, it's non-intoxicating. But along with this idea, see, it's being driven by this notion that intoxication is bad, that it has to be avoided, that it's still the evil weed, but there's this part of it that's good. It's called cannabidiol. And that's the meme that is being promoted in part certainly by people promoting hemp CBD, and it's problematic because yes, CBD, if it's in a product or in a plant in sufficient quantity in relation to THC, will neutralize THC's psychoactivity. But that was never our point in the beginning when we got this ball rolling. It wasn't about negating or deleting psychoactivity. It was about managing psychoactivity. For people who are sensitive, overly sensitive to THC and don't enjoy that, well, CBD is great. It gives them a chance to experience the medical benefits of cannabis without getting high. But the point was really to manage the psychoactivity. The high is not bad. THC and CBD go together, really. We call them the power couple of cannabis therapeutics. You need both, really, to get the most of it. But for some people, they are very sensitive, so they would have a product or a strain that was mainly CBD, low in THC. But for others, you find that balance, what's right for you. That's what we would say. We're not doctors at Project CBD. We don't give medical advice. But in general, our prescription, if you will, is people should use for medicinal purposes a CBD-rich product with as much THC as they're comfortable with. That's the idea. CBD, THC, how do they work? Okay, at the risk of oversimplifying, these plant cannabinoids like CBD and THC, they work by mimicking and augmenting the effects of endogenous compounds, the endo-cannabinoids that our brain and bodies produce 24/7. And these endo-cannabinoids are part of what scientists refer to as the endo-cannabinoid system. And where this talk will be going is what I'm going to propose, and I've never actually talked about this before, is that psychedelics, key aspects of what's therapeutic about psychedelics are actually mediated by the endocannabinoid system, just as CBD and THC are. Not exactly the same way, but it's the same system. So is cannabis psychedelic? I think sort of yes and no. It depends on dosage a lot. High dose of a THC-rich product, whether it's a lump of hash that one would eat or a THC-infused edible that's very strong, yes, it could be psychedelic. There were actually studies done on this in the late 60s by a guy named Dr. Harris Isbell, who was a leading public health official, and he was also a longtime CIA contract employee. They did a study comparing pure THC to LSD, high doses of THC, and he concluded high dose of THC very similar to, in fact, to LSD. That was his conclusion. The paper was published in 1969. So I want to focus a little more on CBD because I think it addresses some of the key conditions that have been coming up repeatedly during this event, this meeting. substance abuse, depression, trauma. I mean, CBD is made to order in some ways for these conditions. And when I say CBD, it's shorthand for CBD rich. It means CBD is part of a full spectrum. There's a lot of research, preclinical research, looking at CBD as an isolated molecule, and now it's been approved as a pharmaceutical for some of these tragic epileptic conditions. The CBD is a legal pharmaceutical in the United States for these specific conditions. But I think when we can break it down, we can look at CBD in terms of addiction, for example. There's a lot of really interesting, compelling research that shows CBD helpful for methamphetamine addiction, cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, even binge drinking, neuroprotective for brain damage from binge drinking. What's interesting, there's a body of research that's emerging. It's relatively small, but it's very compelling, that suggests that CBD has anti-addictive qualities because how it affects memory, particularly cue-induced memory. You know, for an addict or someone who goes through rehab, or maybe it's an ecstasy experience or a ketamine experience or an LSD experience, it's one thing to go through that experience, but if you go back to the same environment where you were and all the same cues that remind you of the time of when you were addicted, it's very difficult to avoid relapsing if you're exposed to the same cues. And what they're finding, at least in animal studies, with CBD, it's somehow that it breaks that visceral connection, that it breaks the link to the cue-induced memory. So that by modifying that, it has this anti-addictive property. So I think this is something really that is a very interesting area of research that will be pursued, hopefully. So now what about depression? This is an area that also very interesting because CBD has strong antidepressant qualities, and I think by looking at how CBD works in that way, I think we can shed a lot of light on how LSD, psilocybin, ketamine also their anti-addictive potential. And I think that the antidepressant properties of psychedelics are very much contingent on this idea of neurogenesis, of the creation of new brain cells, neuroplasticity, synaptogenesis, that the antidepressant qualities of these drugs are tied to the creation of new brain cells, literally. And this process is very much governed by cannabinoids. And how can I say this? And for this, I wanted to refer to a few documents. I'm not going to read in full, but just to give you an idea of what's going on in cannabinoid science in this area in terms of neurogenesis, I'll just read a couple of titles of abstracts, maybe a sentence or two. So this is Cannabinoids, Neurogenesis, and Antidepressant Drugs. That's the title of the abstract. And it says that this study has investigated the potential contribution of cannabinoids and neurogenesis to antidepressant effects. So it's clear that scientists are looking at this. So we have another document. Cannabinoids promote embryonic and adult hippocampus neurogenesis and produce anxiolytic, means anxiety-reducing, and antidepressant-like effects. So there's certain areas of the brain where new brain cells are created all the time, really. So this document refers to how cannabinoid treatment produces anxiolytic and antidepressant-like effects via promotion of hippocampal neurogenesis. This is not, this is it's more than just an emerging consensus. I think this is how scientists understand it. So another one, an understanding of the mechanism by which cannabinoid signaling influences developmental and adult neurogenesis will help foster the development of new therapeutic strategies for neurodevelopmental, psychiatric, and neurological disorders. And then we have, this is just last month, March 19th, from Spanish scientists. Substance abuse causes a disruption in the synaptic plasticity of the brain circuits involved in addiction, with the alteration of normal endocannabinoid activity playing a prominent role. So the endocannabinoid system becomes dysregulated in addiction. So if you can re-regulate it, you can help addiction. That's the idea. Cannabinoid system actually becomes dysregulated in really all diseases. This is another one. Endocannabinoid system is one of the most relevant biochemical systems mediating alcohol addiction. The endocannabinoid system regulates adult neurogenesis. Furthermore, adult neurogenesis is inversely correlated with voluntary consumption of alcohol. These findings suggest that adult hippocampal neurogenesis is a key factor in drug abuse and that it may provide a new strategy strategy for the treatment of alcohol addiction and dependence. There's dozens and dozens of articles like this. This is not out there, edgy stuff anymore. So we have depression that CBD addresses, because CBD is also neurogenic. It also promotes the creation of new brain cells. So does THC. So does LSD and psilocybin and ketamine. And I think some of the mushrooms that Paul Stamets talks about, I think that aren't necessarily psychedelic. Correct me if I'm wrong, cordyceps, lion's mane, and others, that these also have neurogenic properties. Why do some people are so sensitive to THC? And it's because that there are variations on the genes that encode the enzymes that break down THC. You take a drug, you start to metabolize it right away. Well, most people metabolize THC at a certain rate. It gets you high, right? Well, some people have whatever is going on, it's called a polymorphism or a mutation. That they don't metabolize these THC very well, so it stays in the system longer, and they're just much more sensitive to it. Among Caucasians, about 25% have this polymorphism that makes them very sensitive to THC. Among people of African descent, about 10%, Asians 5%. And we all know, probably people in this room, who just don't like cannabis, don't like THC. Gives them the willies. In our circles, we don't feel so much stigmatized by cannabis use. It's more like if you don't like it, you're stigmatized. And we should just understand that this is a matter of genetics, and it's okay, and you could still benefit from cannabis therapeutically. So anyway. If you're in a state that has a medical marijuana program, or if cannabis is legal for adult use, better to get the CBD product from a licensed storefront. Because usually, certainly it's the case in California, the producer has to go through some hoops, and they have to have this stuff validated by the lab. And what's on the label has to correspond to what's actually in there, and you can, with some reasonable degree of confidence, be if not sure, you can have the feeling more likely that the product is not going to be, have solvent residues and pesticide residues of too much and so forth. So always better to get it from a licensed storefront. As for what you get in gas stations or what you get on streets of New York or at the coffee shops now, that's like a crapshoot. I mean, some of the stuff's okay, but the main problem is it's mainly just CBD and maybe a little bit of THC in there. That's the biggest problem as far as we're concerned. Consumer Reports is going to come out with a big study on these products, and we're really waiting for that one. So, because we're always asked, well, what do you recommend for people that don't live in California? What should they get? And we don't really recommend specific products in general, but I've just been sort of biding my tongue and waiting for the consumer, hurry up already, So we'll see. We're looking forward to that.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Cheryl Franzel, Geraldine Hess, Lori Putnam, Shannon Hudson, and Ian Golden. Our music is by Nico Holloman. The Psychedelic Integration Conference was produced by Allan Badiner in conjunction with Dream Mulick. If you'd like to hear more episodes, please find us on iTunes. And if you like what you're hearing, take a second to subscribe, rate us, and review. You can also find all of our episodes at our website, esalen.org. That's ESALEN.org. The Esalen Institute is a nonprofit organization. Programs like this one are made possible by the support of our donors.